The car is a 1926 3-liter. This is the smallest engine in the vintage Bentley, and the original vintage Bentley configuration that W.O. Bentley designed in 1919. This is a speed model, which means that it has a little different cam setup and dual carburetors and that sort of stuff. This engine is a 4-cylinder overhead cam, dual carburetors, dual ignition, 4-speed gearbox, and great big brakes on it all around. And when it was new, it was a very expensive car. This car in 1926 cost 1,175 pounds, British pounds, when a pound was about $4.50 to $5 a pound. Now, to put that in perspective, you could buy a new Model T Ford in 1926 for about $300. Mm-hmm. So this was a $5,000 car when your neighbor's new Ford cost $300 bucks. So, very, very expensive car. This is the body on the car is what's referred to as a Le Mans style Tourer. This particular body on this car is a factory team race car body. You'll notice that it's kind of dull looking. Well, it's fabric covering over a light wooden framework with some padding on it to smooth it out and a few aluminum formers to make the curves. The idea was that this is very light, as they use these cars in competition. This body on this car came off one of the factory team cars and was put onto this chassis in about 1935, when it was just an old used car. And certainly the last thing you want to do when you're fixing up an old used car is tell your customer that it has some old clapped out race car body on it. So it wasn't publicized. And this is something we've discovered with the help of some people in England within the last 10-15 years. They drive really well. It's a 1926 automobile that you can run down the highway at 60 miles an hour and still stop.
And how long have you had the car, and what kind of shape was it in when you got it?
I bought this car in the early 90s, and it was cosmetically, it looked pretty much as you see it now. We've done a fair amount of mechanical work over the years, up to and including rebuilding the engine, and there is some maintenance to be done on the car. However, during that time we've driven it a lot. We put nearly 30,000 miles in this car.
My.
We've taken it across country. We did our engine break-in Alaska several years back, and we've had it in 26 states in the U.S. and 4 Canadian provinces. So they do get driven.
It's comfortable to ride it?
Surprisingly enough. I can ride in this car all day and my back doesn't bother me, which is more than I can say for some cars. I've traced we've been able to trace the ownership history of this car with a small gap in between. We know who had it and where it was from new to 1936, and we know who bought it in 1941, and have traced the ownership from there on. And I've had the privilege of speaking to the owners of this car after the war. There were 4 other owners after the war before I got it, and the car was first fixed up rather than restored, just to sort of put back together and put on the road in 1947. Mm-hmm. That's when these fenders were built in this configuration, and that fellow drove it for about 5 years and sold it to another fellow who drove it for a relatively short period of time before it was laid up. And the gentleman who bought it right after the war and did the work on it repurchased it in 1975 and restored the car the first time then. And since then it had some other work when it came to this country, about 1980.
How long have you owned it?
I've had it since the early 90s.
What year is it?
26. Yeah.
That's what a 4-cylinder is?
This is a 4-cylinder, 3-liter 4-cylinder. Overhead cam.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Dual ignition, dual carburetor. All kinds of
What, Weber colors?
issues.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, John. I've noticed on a lot of these cars, these leaf springs, they either have covers on them or they've been wrapped with a binding.
With a cord, yeah.
Well, why is that?
Well, the covers on them, and this car actually should have covers on it. I just haven't done it. The covers on them keep them clean and keep the water out and keep grease in. So they'll stay a little bit more supple. This one I end up having to jack it up, take the weight off, and oil those springs about once a year. The corded springs, as you see on the Speed 6 over here, that was for competition purposes because that actually stiffened the springs. That kept things tighter. So the Le Mans cars, the race cars, the factory race cars would have corded springs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, has this one ever raced?
I've raced it some.
You have?
Yes, I've run it in some competitions. The chassis, as far as I know, has no race history. The race history is attached to the body on this car. The car that this body came from, by way of deduction and ruling out all the other possibilities, came off a car known as Old Number 7, which belonged to a fellow named Dudley Benjafield, and he and his co-driver was S.C.H. Davis, also known as Sammy Davis, but not that Sammy Davis, the other Sammy Davis. They drove this car, the chassis that this body was on, at Le Mans in 1927, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, France. And they were involved in a very famous wreck called the White House Corner Crash. And there were 4 Bentleys in the race. 3 of them were wiped out in that race. They were done. They were able to get the 3-liter back up and going, somewhat crippled, 1 headlamp and a bent up wing, and got it back to the pits and worked on it for a bit and took off and won the race with the car.
No, my.
So it had the body in this car has a rather storied history. It was that car was broken up in the early 30s, and the chassis and the engine have since been reunited, and we happen to have the body on this car. So
do you happen to know when this car came to America?
Around 1980.
Yeah.
And it was on the West Coast for a while.
Are you able to adjust the suspension here?
Absolutely. Yep. And when I have run it in competition, the competition I've used this car in most. I've had it on the track a couple of times. Most of what I've done are hill climbs of the British sort.
Okay.
That
I know a little bit about that.
Yeah, you know, under a mile.
Sure.
Twisty windies, and you crank those shocks up a bit so that the suspension doesn't move very much.
So you stiffen it up for hill climbing.
Yeah, you stiffen the suspension because the chassis is plenty flexible. And that was the traditional British way of making these cars handle for a long time, was very, very stiff suspension and a flexible chassis.
I see. Yeah, very good.